camera fades in on the endless Kansas plains at dusk. A single abandoned farmhouse sits crooked against the horizon, its windows shattered, its roof half collapsed. A voice cuts through the silence. In the summer of 1878, 4 brothers vanished from this house. They were never declared dead, never declared missing. Instead, their names were erased, systematically, deliberately, as if they had never been born. And to this day, no institution, no scientist, no historian will touch their story. Why? The screen cuts to black, the sound of a slow, deliberate heartbeat rising. Then, faint whispers, like children murmuring a prayer backwards, bleed into the silence. This is not just a disappearance. This is an open wound in American history, a memory deliberately buried. And tonight we're digging it up. The 4 brothers belonged to the Calloway family, a farming household on the edge of Atchison County, Kansas. Records list their parents, Jonathan and Eliza Calloway, as devout Methodists, hard workers, and well-regarded in the parish. Yet in every census after 1878, their household count drops from 6 to 2. No children, no burial records, no obituaries, just absence. Neighbors whispered that the boys were peculiar. Quiet, too quiet, and often seen staring at corners of rooms as if waiting for someone unseen. A local priest later confessed that the Calloway children would not kneel, would not bow, and their eyes glowed strangely in the firelight. But these testimonies were hidden, buried deep in parish archives. The deeper one digs, the more disturbing the silence becomes. Families vanish all the time in frontier America. Cholera, starvation, raids. But this was different. This was erasure. July 1878 was marked by unrelenting heat. Crops withered, wells ran dry, and tempers flared in small Kansas towns where survival always felt fragile. On the night of July 19th, neighbors reported a strange glow at the Calloway property. Lights spilling out of every crack of the farmhouse as if the walls themselves were burning from the inside. Yet no fire consumed the wood, and no smoke rose into the sky. By morning, the house was still standing, but the children were gone. Jonathan and Eliza sat wordless on the porch, staring across the prairie. When asked where the boys had gone, they replied only, "They have been called." Sheriff Daniel Mercer filed a missing persons report, but the details evaporated. No documents remain in county records. The only surviving trace is a scrawled note from Mercer's deputy. He told us not to speak of them again. Within weeks, the sheriff resigned, packed his belongings, and left Kansas for good. He never returned. The silence was contagious. Families that once spoke of the Calloways clammed up. Neighbors who had watched the boys play in the fields began insisting there had never been any children at all. This wasn't mere forgetfulness. It was an enforced amnesia. Someone was making people rewrite their own memories. One of the few surviving records comes from the town's one-room schoolhouse. In the attendance book, the Calloway children's names were carefully inked for nearly 3 years. Then, midway through July of 1878, their entries stop abruptly. The teacher, a young woman named Clara Vance, scribbled a single phrase across the empty line where their names should have been. Not fit for study. She resigned a week later, citing nervous exhaustion. According to her surviving family, Clara never taught again. She suffered hallucinations, night terrors, and near the end of her life, she would often mutter, "They watch from the corners. They want us to forget." In 1881, a locked journal surfaced from Father Elias Granger, the town's parish priest. In his writings, he described countless failed attempts to baptize the Calloway boys. Holy water evaporated when it touched their skin. Their voices carried a strange double resonance, like two tones speaking in unison. Granger wrote, "I came to fear them not as children of God, but as empty vessels. Something used them as masks, and when they looked upon me, I felt my own prayers recoil." The journal ends abruptly with the words, "They are not ours to claim." Weeks later, Father Granger was found wandering barefoot on the prairie, his tongue bitten in half. Decades later, testimonies gathered from old settlers reveal something even stranger. Neighbors recalled hearing the brothers' laughter in the fields long after their disappearance. On windless nights, they swore they saw four small figures standing in the Callaway yard, motionless, their shadows stretching unnaturally far beneath the moon. But when asked why they never reported this to authorities, every witness gave the same answer: "We were told they were never born." The uniformity of this response is chilling. It suggests a pressure, an external weight upon memory itself. The event was not only physical, but psychological, infecting thought and erasing testimony. Here, the story bleeds into institutional corruption. In 1879, records show that the Callaways donated their farmstead to a Methodist orphanage. But the deed transfer is unusual. It contains no signatures, only 4 sets of crude handprints, pressed deep into the parchment as if burned there by heat. The orphanage operated for 12 years before closing abruptly. No records survive of the children housed there. Local rumor insists the orphans were studied by church officials, and that screams were heard at night from the old Callaway property. Yet no official investigation was ever conducted. In 1902, an academic from Chicago named Dr. Edward Lang attempted to collect testimonies for a psychological study. He was met with locked doors and whispered threats. Local authorities informed him the Callaway story was taboo. When Lang published a brief paper titled The Children of Erasure, it was pulled from circulation within weeks. Universities denounced it as fabrication. His notes vanished from archives. Lang himself withdrew from public life, later writing, "The brothers cannot be studied because they are not phenomena. They are mirrors. They reflect back what we refuse to admit about ourselves." The most damning artifact is a single faded photograph, discovered in the archives of the Kansas Historical Society. It shows the Callaway farmhouse with 4 blurred shapes standing near the porch. Their forms are distorted, elongated, as if the camera could not fully register them. Where their faces should be, only blank smears of white light appear. Shortly after the photograph was catalogued, the archivist who handled it was found dead in his office. His final note read, "They looked at me from inside the paper. They were waiting." By the turn of the century, the Callaway farm was abandoned. Yet farmers working nearby fields spoke of hearing children's voices drifting through the corn at dusk. Always 4 distinct tones, whispering in unison. Some swore the stalks moved against the wind, bending as if something unseen walked between the rows. One farmer recorded in his journal, "They call each other's names in the dark, but when I listen closer, they are calling mine instead." He disappeared 2 weeks later, leaving his boots neatly placed at the edge of the Callaway property. In 1910, a sealed packet of correspondence emerged from a seminary in St. Louis. Priests debated whether the Callaway boys should be classified as spiritual anomalies or signs of possession. One chilling letter reads, "We dare not publish what we know, for if the people understood that children can be born without souls, faith itself would collapse." The seminary ordered all records destroyed, but fragments survived in the margins of theology books. Scribbles describing the brothers as vessels for a presence older than Scripture. When the Atchison Railroad expanded westward in 1916, workers stumbled across the ruins of a stone cellar beneath the Callaway property. Inside were crude carvings, 4 identical stick figures, each etched with hollow circles for eyes. The cellar smelled of sulfur, though no fire had touched it. The workers reported their find to supervisors. By the next week, every man who entered the cellar had either quit the job or left the state. The cellar was sealed with concrete, and the railroad company denied it ever existed. By the 1920s, the Callaway Four had become a whispered legend in university halls. Folklore students who attempted theses on the subject found their funding pulled, their careers quietly destroyed. Professors warned, "There are stories we are not permitted to examine. This is one of them." A letter from an anthropology professor at Yale put it bluntly. The Callaway brothers cannot be written about because once their names are spoken, they arrive. Jonathan and Eliza Callaway outlived all whispers of their sons. Neighbors described them as hollow people, shadows of themselves. They never sold the property, never farmed again. Instead, they sat on their porch each evening, staring into the fields. When Eliza died in 1923, her obituary listed her as having no children. Jonathan followed 3 years later. His gravestone bears no family inscription, only the words, "We were not meant to keep them." In 1931, a WPA fieldworker collecting oral histories from elderly Kansans uncovered something chilling. 2 elderly women, sisters, claimed they had played with the Callaway boys as children. But when pressed for details, both began weeping uncontrollably. One managed to choke out, "They weren't 4. They were 1. Just 1, splitting into pieces when we looked too long." The recording of this interview was never archived. It was labeled disturbing and destroyed. The sisters died within months, both from sudden heart failure. Declassified letters from the 1940s show federal interest in the Callaway site. The War Department considered the property for paranormal investigation of psychological warfare potential. But the documents end with a stark warning: no further study. Do not pursue. This is not a weapon. It is a contagion of memory. One agent scrawled in the margin, "They are not to be studied because study gives them shape. They require silence to remain bound." By 1947, rumors spread that 4 unmarked graves had appeared in the Callaway family plot. Locals saw them. Shallow mounds of earth, child-sized, each marked by a crude wooden cross. But by morning, the graves were gone, the soil untouched. A photograph taken that night shows 4 faint depressions in the grass. Yet county surveyors denied they existed. It was as though the earth itself refused to hold their remains. The final recorded testimony comes from a drifter named Samuel Hayes, who camped near the ruins in 1950. His diary, later found in a Topeka pawn shop, describes hearing 4 voices whispering outside his tent. "We are still here. We never left. Say our names." He did not write what happened next. The diary ends with pages torn out, smeared with something dark. Hayes vanished. His belongings were found folded neatly, his fire still burning. Today, no official records acknowledge the Callaway brothers. Census documents, parish notes, school ledgers, all expunged. The farmhouse rotted into dust, the land sold and resold, each owner denying knowledge of its past. Yet when researchers whisper about the case, one detail recurs: the refusal of science itself to touch it. Not because the story lacks evidence, but because evidence bends around it, erodes, vanishes. The Callaway 4 are not forgotten, they are in forced silence. And in that silence they linger, watching from the corners, waiting for someone, anyone, to remember their names,